Madam President, I rise today to speak on a matter of great importance that seems to have slipped through the cracks of the public's consciousness. However, with growing furor over the recent scandal at the Veterans Administration, I expect that more and more people will become aware of it. I didn't think it's unreasonable to argue that most Americans would be outraged to learn that the federal government pays tens of millions of dollars every year to pay hundreds, if not thousands, of government employees not to work. This practice used to be called feather bedding. The term feather bedding originally referred to any person who is pampered, coddled, or excessively rewarded. It was later used to describe certain labor relations practices. According to Wikipedia, quote, the modern use of the term in the labor relations setting began in the United States railroad industry, which used feathered mattresses in sleeping cars. Railway labor unions, confronted with changing technology, which led to widespread unemployment, sought to preserve jobs by negotiating contracts which required employers to compensate workers to do little or no work, or which required complex and time-consuming work rules so as to generate a full day's work for an employee who otherwise would not remain unemployed, unquote. Congress tried to put an end to the practice in the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act amendments, which define and outlaw feather bedding. However, the U.S. Supreme Court has narrowly defined the terminology, leaving most practices undisturbed. The feather bedding-like practice I'm referring to today is most often called, quote, official time, unquote, wherein government employees who are highly compensated, often including overtime pay, are paid to perform work for the government, only work for the benefit of their unions. These, quote, employees, unquote, are not union employees, nor are they paid by the union. Instead, they are union members paid by the taxpayers to work full-time for the union while working for the federal government. Of course, this practice also goes on in the private sector. However, in the private sector, the feather bedding comes off of the bottom line and is negotiated as a measure of ensuring labor peace and in exchange for other union concessions. In the federal government, where the bottom line is the taxpayer and where unions are not permitted to strike, this practice is a way for weak managers to use government funds to reward private sector union political supporters and financial contributors, passing the costs on to the unknowing taxpayer for services not rendered. In the private sector, official time is carefully monitored and controlled. In the federal sector, managers generally look the other way. According to the Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, during fiscal year 2011, unions represented 1,202,733 non-postal federal civil service bargaining unit employees, an increase of more than 17,000 employees compared to fiscal year 2010. In that same year, agencies responded that bargaining unit employees spent nearly 3.4 million hours on official time, an increase of nearly 10% compared to the previous year. How much money are we talking about? And why should American taxpayers shoulder the entire burden if the official time is only for union work? Now, Madam President, you may be wondering what this has to do with the VA scandal. Well, I don't think it's a coincidence that the VA, which is plagued by incompetence, dishonesty, and bureaucratic ineptitude, utilizes the practice of official time more than any other federal agency, according to OPM. In 2011, the VA reported paying out nearly 1 million hours in official time, an increase of more than 23% over the previous year. The cost of official time in 2011 amounted to nearly $43 million. That's $43 million paid out to VA, quote, employees, unquote, to do union work full time. As Wall Street Journal editorial board writer Kimberly Strassel noted a few weeks back, quote, "The VA boasts one of the largest federal workforces, and VA Secretary Eric Shinseki bragged in 2010 that 2/3 of it is unionized. That's a whopping 200,000 union members, represented by the likes of the American Federation of Government Employees and the Service Employees International Union," unquote. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Wall Street Journal editorial that I just mentioned or reference be placed in the record at this point or immediately following my remarks. I ask unanimous consent that that be placed immediately following my remarks.
Without objection.
Okay. Union supporters often lament that under federal law, federal employee unions are relatively toothless, especially when compared to the very powerful state employee unions. However, as Ms. Strassel noted, given its size and influence, the VA union may be an exception to that rule. Once again, 2/3 of the VA workforce is unionized, and the agency has paid out more than $40 million in salaries to full-time union workers in a single year. That has to have an impact on the VA's efficiency, and that's for workers that don't do any work except for the union. Obviously, the inefficiency of the VA has recently been the subject of a very high-profile public debate. However, the impact unions have had on the VA's operation was being talked about well before news of the recent scandal broke. For example, Senators Portman and Coburn sent a letter to former VA Secretary Shinseki in 2013, noting that the vast majority of VA employees on official time were trained nurses, instrument technicians, pharmacists, dental assistants, or therapists. In other words, these were employees hired specifically to fulfill roles in direct support of veterans. Yet instead of caring for veterans, processing claims, and helping to eliminate the horrendous backlog, these employees were being paid to do union work full-time, all at the expense of taxpayers. On top of that, union negotiated work rules over things like seniority and job classification have contributed to the bureaucratic nightmare at the VA. In addition, the unions have been the most vocal opponents of any reform proposals that would give veterans access to outside health care. So, while it may be overstating the union's influence to assign to them the blame for the entire VA scandal, it is clear that these unions have at least contributed to the problems we're now seeing at the agency. They are at least partially to blame for the backlog in veterans' claims. They are at least partially to blame for the failed VA bureaucracy, and they are at least partially to blame for the failure of reasonable attempts to reform the agency in the past. And it's almost impossible to reform it the way it's currently run. Now, Madam President, I wish I could say that this problem is isolated at the VA. Unfortunately, there's at least one other scandal-plagued agency with a similar union problem. I'm talking, of course, about the IRS. We're all pretty familiar with the IRS targeting scandal. By its own admission, the agency was targeting Tea Party groups in the run-up to the elections in both 2010 and 2012. And like the VA, the IRS consists of a heavily unionized workforce. About 66% of IRS employees belong to the National Treasury Employees Union, or NTEU. It shouldn't surprise anyone to learn that the NTEU is extremely active in politics, having twice endorsed President Obama. During the 2010 election cycle, when the IRS first began targeting conservative groups, the NTEU raised over $600,000 through its PAC, almost all of which went to Democrats. In the next election in 2012, the NTEU PAC raised more than $700,000, 94% of which went to Democrats. In other words, Madam President, during the same campaign cycles in which the IRS was targeting conservative organizations that were critical of the president, his administration, and in many cases the IRS itself. For harassment and extra scrutiny, the union that represents nearly 2/3 of IRS employees was busy raising and donating well over $1 million to Democratic candidates. And you wonder why the partisanship at the IRS, which should not be partisan in any way, shape, or form, but it's filled with this partisanship stuff. And we should not have unions at the IRS or at the VA. Is it any surprise that the agency found itself predisposed toward harming conservative organizations or their causes? And of course, the IRS has its own issues with the practice of paying out official time. Indeed, as of 2011, there were at least 200 IRS employees working full-time for their union, all at taxpayers' expense. In that same year, the agency paid out more than 625,000 hours of official time. The total cost of these union activities to the taxpayers was roughly around $27 million, but that's only the beginning. That's $27 million in a single year paid out to, quote, employees, unquote, of the federal government who did nothing but union work. That's simply preposterous, Madam President. And like I said, if the American people understood this type of fleecing of the taxpayers goes on every day, they'd be outraged. Current law allows most federal employees to be represented by a union. There are, however, some exceptions, and good reasons for these exceptions. Most of these exceptions are for agencies that perform a national security function or highly sensitive work. You would think the IRS would fit in that category. You would think that the VA administration would fit in that category. For example, we don't allow employees at the FBI, the CIA, or the Secret Service to be unionized. Good reason for that. We don't need partisan political activities in those agencies, but we don't need them in the IRS or the Veterans Administration either. We also don't allow employees at the GAO or the Federal Labor Relations Authority to unionize. In days to come, Congress is going to have to take a hard look at reforming both the Veterans Administration and the IRS. One of the questions we're going to have to ask ourselves is whether these agencies, with their important and sensitive missions and their poor performance in the recent past, should be added to the list of agencies not permitted to unionize, not permitted to be partisan. And anybody who doesn't understand that doesn't understand anything about politics. In addition, as we can continually look for ways to improve the efficiency of our government, we need to examine the overall practice of official time and determine whether it should be eliminated entirely. I, for one, don't believe that taxpayers ought to be footing the bill for union work. I think that the majority of the American people, if given an opportunity to fully understand this practice and the abuse it entails, would agree with me. One thing is for sure, Madam President, if what we've seen at the VA and the IRS is in any way representative of the influence unions have on government agencies, drastic changes are going to be necessary. Now, Madam President, how can any American citizen feel that the IRS is above politics when it's run by a union? And we all know that the unions support almost 100% one party over the other. How can we feel that the VA is going to be handled right when it has a union representing it and determining all the work rules? Do you know how difficult it is? I talked to the IRS commissioners since I've been on the Finance Committee, and they admit that to try and correct or punish an IRS employee that is out of control and not doing what's right, it takes upward of a year, if you're lucky. And that's why there's all kinds of politics in these agencies, and they act with impunity in advancing what really are liberal causes. If there are any two agencies that should not have unions in them, one ought to be the IRS, the other one ought to be the VA administration. Now, I was raised in the union movement. I learned a trade. I went through a formal apprenticeship program. I became a journeyman woodwire and metal lather. And I'm proud of that. And I believe that unions have a place in our society. But they have become more and more partisan. 40% of union members, it is reported, are Republicans. And yet, almost 100% of every dime that's given in politics is given to Democrats. So by any measure, you've got to say that these folks are partisan, which I think is their right. But should we have partisan control of agencies like the IRS that everybody has to deal with at one time or another in their lives, and the Veterans Administration, which is in dire jeopardy right now because of the way it's being run? I've been very much trying to do straightforward investigation of the IRS with all of these accusations that have been thrown at the IRS, many of which are true. And the more I get into it, the more I realize it's being run in a partisan way for one party, when it should be run in a nonpartisan way for neither party. I think we've got to do something about it. I hope the American people pay attention to this, because I think most people, including union members, would be outraged to know that there's partisanship at these agencies, that is not just average partisanship, it's blatant partisanship. And the more I get into it, the more I realize that that's true. With that, I suggest I yield the floor.